All right, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Will Inboden, Executive Director of the Clements Center, and honored to be welcoming all of you to the latest installment in our Spring Speaker Series. And this one is a particularly exciting one. We are honored to be doing this in conjunction with President Jay Hartzell and the UT President's Office. And I will be turning it over to President Hartzell in a minute to officially welcome our special guest today. But let me just say that for me, it is always a fraught thing to be welcoming and introducing the man who signs my paycheck. But in the case of President Hartzell, it is certainly an honor to do so. In his first several months at the university, amidst all the challenges of dealing with the global pandemic and all the other hard missions of running a university, he's also made a very strong commitment to viewpoint diversity, to freedom of speech, to broader academic inquiry, and especially to engagement with the big issues of the day from a variety of perspectives. And it's really in that spirit that we're honored to be bringing today's event to you. So I'm going to turn it over now to the captain of the battleship Texas, Jay Hartzell. Mr. President, over to you.
Great. Thanks a lot, Will. And I will start off and say thanks to Will Inboden for his leadership of the Clements Center, for helping us with today's event, getting this together and luring Karl into the fold for the day. We really appreciate, Will, all you do. And I do come from the business school, so I have sort of two columns, assets and liabilities, and Will, you're an asset. And I'm really grateful that to have you as part of our team and for all that you do. Today, we're going to discuss a topic of vital importance to all of us, the future of our political system. Addressing the issue facing our democracy isn't just a matter of national pride or even just national security. It's a matter of changing the world by leading it. Here at UT, we change the world through research and teaching. Today, we'll hear from someone who's done the research, has the experience, and is here to teach and discuss with us. From there, it's up to us, all of us, to go out and change the world. Karl Rove is perhaps best known for his role as senior advisor to President George W. Bush from 2000 to 2007 and White House Deputy Chief of Staff from 2004 to 2007. Before he became the architect, as he was known for his role in President Bush's 2000 and 2004 campaigns, he was president of Karl Rove and Company, a public affairs firm based here in Austin. His clients included over 75 U.S. Senate, congressional, and gubernatorial candidates in 24 states, as well as the moderate party of Sweden. Karl writes an op-ed for the Wall Street Journal every week and is a regular contributor to Fox News. He's the author of The Triumph of William McKinley, Why the Election of 1896 Still Matters, and Courage and Consequence, his New York Times best-selling memoir. A Colorado native, he's attended the University of Utah, the University of Maryland College Park, George Mason University, and the University of Texas at Austin. Karl has taught here on the UT campus, instructing graduate students over at the LBJ School of Public Affairs, as well as undergraduates in the School of Journalism and the Department of Government. He now serves on the University of Texas Chancellor's Council Executive Committee and is a member of the UT's McDonald Observatory Board of Visitors. Karl is also a member of the Board of Trustees for the Texas Parks and Wildlife Foundation, the Texas State History Museum Foundation, and the Texas Philosophical Society. As you can tell, history is one of his great passions. Now, Karl, as you know, the Texas Philosophical Society was created in 1837, the year after the Texas Revolution. Its purpose was, quote, the collection and diffusion of knowledge, specifically regarding the moral and social condition of Texas, as well as the 1,000 other topics of interest, which our new and rising republic unfolds to the philosopher, the scholar, and the man of the world. Such a goal resonates with us here at UT. We too are in the collection and diffusion of the knowledge business, and we are also focused on serving the people of Texas, a place which almost 200 years later still manages to both be new and rising, which still remains of great interest to the philosopher, scholar, and man of the world. With that in mind, perhaps it's no surprise that plans for this university were first made in the year that followed the founding of the Texas Philosophical Society. In 1838, the Republic selected the fledgling town of Waterloo as a future site for both the state government and the University of Texas. Land was set aside for both institutions above the north bank of the Colorado. One section was Capitol Square, another further north was College Hill. Today, as you know, Waterloo is called Austin, Capitol Square is home to the Texas Legislature, and College Hill is the home to UT. Ever since College Hill and Capitol Square, in today's parlance, the Dome and the Tower, have been partners in creating an ever more democratically vibrant Texas. Karl, you've moved in both worlds, politics and academia, so I look forward to seeing what you have to say to the next generation of public policy professionals, strategists, and political leaders that we're mentoring here and training at UT. As we listen today, I trust we'll also keep in mind our university's official motto, Disciplina Praesidium Civitatis, which always makes me a little nervous because it requires me to read Latin, which can be translated from Latin as the cultivated mind is the guardian of democracy. That phrase is coined by none other than Mirabeau Lamar, the second person elected president of the Republic of Texas, and a founder of the Texas Philosophical Society. Fostering world-changing research, training students to drive knowledge and grow the economy, encouraging robust debates about hard topics, including this one, is how we here on campus cultivate minds and guard democracy. So with that, please join me in welcoming Mr. Karl Rove. And Karl, I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you, Mr. President. I appreciate that kind introduction. And boy, you got some good research there with the Texas Philosophical Society. I'm honored to be a member of it, but you have to take it with a little bit of a grain of salt. It was founded by Mirabeau B. Lamar. You're right, the second president of the Republic of Texas, who inflated our currency and almost brought us to economic disaster, and by Sam Houston, who helped found it and who was Lamar's great rival for power in the new republic, and eventually became the governor of the state of Texas, and was, of course, as you may recall, forced out of office by his refusal to sign the Articles of Succession. He refused to leave the Union. He'd been a Jackson man and believed in Texas being part of the United States and the United States being free and together. And when it could no longer be together, he cast his lot with what cost him his job. So anyway, thanks for having me here today. It's good to be back involved in UT campus activity. The president and Will have, in a moment of mental weakness, asked me if I'd teach a course this fall, which I intend to do. I thoroughly enjoyed my time teaching at UT in the 90s. I taught a graduate course in joint appointment with the journalism department and the School of Government, the Department of Government in the early 90s, called Press and Politics. Paul Bagala was my predecessor in that particular role, representing the political side of it. And with Dave McNeely, then of the Austin American Statesman, they taught the course for a couple of years, and then Paul went to join the Clinton administration, and I was asked to take up his place. I also thoroughly enjoyed teaching a class at the OBJ school to graduate students called the Modern American Presidential Campaign. I did that before I actually was the strategist for 2 presidential campaigns. So I was sort of learning along with my students, but I thoroughly enjoyed that as well. And that's sort of what we're going to be talking about this fall in my class, is the modern presidential campaign. So we'll have an interesting time. Lots of interesting visitors who played roles in various campaigns, both Democrat and Republican. There's a little bit of a fraternity or sorority or a fraternal organization of people who play a role in presidential campaigns that doesn't respect political labels. You sort of have a mutual respect for people who've done it on the other side. And some of those people are my friends and will be coming to involve themselves in the course, as well as some of my fellow Republicans. So we'll have a very bipartisan campaign seminar. I've been asked to talk about our broken political system, because it is broken. It doesn't take much to recognize that. Confidence in our institutions, measured by public opinion polls, is at or near the lowest point in the history of those polls, which go back in some instances 80 or 90 years. In fact, recent polls have shown a pretty dramatic drop in the last 30 years in confidence in government, in the media, in organized religion, and in our culture, in the institutions from which we derive that, whether it's churches or Hollywood. In fact, I saw a poll last year before George Floyd's death that showed that about the only 2 institutions that had kept the confidence of the American people over that period were the military and law enforcement. And we know since last summer what's happened to confidence in law enforcement. We're at a tribal moment too in politics, where it seems that it's almost a bad word to say compromise, or it's something nasty and untoward to say bipartisanship. And that's difficult because our system is built upon compromise and built upon incrementalism and built upon the sense that nobody gets to have all their way all at one time, quickly and easily. The founders didn't want that. They saw that rightly or wrongly as what was present in the politics and the governance of the mother country, the United Kingdom. And You know, we in Texas take a lot of things for granted. One of the things that we shouldn't take for granted is that we're the only state in the union that I'm aware of that doesn't organize its legislature on a partisan basis. When I go around the country and I talk about politics, and I tell people that in Texas, where politics is a blood sport up to and including the election day, but that afterwards we organize our legislature on a nonpartisan basis with Republican and Democratic committee chairs and vice chairs. And thus it's been since the 1970s. When I came to Texas as a young man and went to work in the legislature, I worked for a Republican who'd been a committee chair. And that's when there were less than 16 members of the Republicans in the Texas House of 150 members. And we keep that tradition alive today. And I think it's important. The longest serving committee chair in the Senate is John Whitmire of Houston, a Democrat. And I think that says something, that we've made the transition from Republican statewide leadership, actually Democratic statewide leadership, to Republican statewide leadership, and still kept this bipartisan element of our legislature, which I think is really important, particularly in moments of crisis. We'll find reasons to disagree once every 10 years over redistricting, and there'll be hot button issues that'll pop up that will divide our legislature on partisan lines. But most of what it does, and most of the time it operates, it's done so in a bipartisan way, and I think that's constructive. But that's not the way our country is operating. Our country is in a tribal moment where if you're of one tribe and your guy or gal gets attacked by the other tribe, you rally to their support, whether it's right or wrong to do so, and vice versa. How broken is it? Take a look at the last two presidential elections. In 2016, we had the two most unpopular candidates who've ever been nominated for president. And that's a scientific fact. Just look at the polls. Just before Election Day, Hillary Rodham Clinton's unfavorables were 54 and Donald J. Trump's were 56% unfavorable. And yet they voted for him. It really came down to a question of change versus status quo, because neither person was thought to have the qualifications, the temperament, the right experience to be president, particularly Trump. And yet he was seen as a candidate of change. And of the 2/3 of the American people who felt that they wanted change, the almost 2/3, they voted overwhelmingly for him. And of the people who wanted, to keep things going the way that they were going, they voted overwhelmingly for her. And it was after a contentious set of primaries. The primaries themselves were an indication that our political system was in trouble. The Republicans had 17 candidates, including the governors of the second and third most populous states in the union, some accomplished lawmakers, a president of a Fortune 50 company, the nation's arguably the nation's leading brain surgeon, and Donald Trump, a New York real estate guy who proceeded to systematically take apart every one of his 16 Republican primary opponents, mainly because he was the guy who said to the base of the Republican Party, I know you're angry and you want somebody to take a brick and throw it through the plate glass window, and I'm the guy to do it. And on the Democratic side, we similarly had an unusual circumstance. We had Hillary Clinton, former United States Senator, former Secretary of State, former First Lady of the United States, former First Lady of the state of Arkansas, a co-partner in the most powerful modern political machine we've seen, the Clinton political machine of the 1990s and the early 2000s. She was the establishment choice of the Democrats, and her opponent was a man who had never run for office as a Democrat. From his first election to local office in Burlington, Vermont, all the way to his election as mayor, his election to Congress, and his election to the United States Senate, Bernie Sanders never ran as a Democrat. In fact, the first Democratic National Convention he ever attended was that was held in 2016, where he was the runner-up for the nomination. And while she had the money and the influence and the endorsements and the machinery, he had a growing element inside the Democratic Party that said that we're tired of incrementalism. We want dramatic reform. We want dramatic change. And so we're going to support the Democratic Socialists from Vermont, Bernie Sanders. And he gave her a run for her money. It was not until the ending contest in late May and early June that she actually secured the requisite number of delegates to become the nominee of the Democratic Party. The general election was similarly raw and angry and nasty and mean, and it resolved itself on election night with an improbable result. 78,000 votes in 3 states, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. Those states went for Donald Trump by that margin, and thereby provided him the Electoral College votes to beat her in the Electoral College 306 to 232. And it all boiled down to change. People knew in their bones that he didn't have what we had previously required of presidential candidates, but he represented change, and that's what they wanted. So he won this narrow margin, and again, by a handful of votes, 78,000 out of over 13 million cast in those 3 states alone. Then we go forward to 2020, and we have another weird election. We have 2 candidates campaigning in a pandemic, in the midst of a pandemic, in a very different way. One man is attempting to dominate the media, both as a president and as a presidential candidate, the incumbent Donald Trump. And the other candidate, after dispatching Bernie Sanders in the primary, decides in March and April and May to basically go underground. And by May has very few events, picking and choosing the interviews that he gives from his basement in Wilmington, Delaware, and leaves the stage open to the incumbent president. And again, we come down to a relatively close election. Yeah, there are a big chunk of votes differentiating the two, about 7 million votes between their totals. But again, it comes down to 3 states and 1 congressional district, a total of 65,000 votes in 3 states, Arizona, Georgia, and Wisconsin, and 22,000 votes of that 65,000 in 1 congressional district, Nebraska's 2nd congressional district. Nebraska is one of 2 states, along with Maine, that breaks its electoral college vote out by congressional district. And Joe Biden wins the 2nd congressional district of Nebraska by 22,000 votes. So altogether, 65,000 votes in those 3 states and 1 congressional district give him the same number of votes in the Electoral College that Donald Trump had received 4 years before, 306. And if he had lost those 3 states and Nebraska's 2nd congressional district, Trump would still be president. We now have a 50-50 Senate as a result of the election. So the Democrats control it by virtue of holding the vice presidency, which can break a tie in the Senate. And the House, rather than losing seats in the House, as the Republicans were expected to do, and the Democrats winning seats as they won the White House, as a White House party tends to do in the first election. Instead, the Republicans picked up 12 seats in the House, leaving the Democrats with a 5-seat margin when the congressional elections were over. That because of retirements and deaths has now declined to a 3-vote margin for the Democrats. So they can't pass any legislation unless they keep all but 3 members of the House Democratic Caucus aboard on legislation. Now, this isn't the only weird recent presidential election that we've had, 2020 and 2016. 2000, you may remember, some of you have probably heard from your parents, or maybe were old enough to remember it somewhere along the line. George W. Bush is elected president by 537 votes in Florida. And in 2012, something happens to Barack Obama, who'd been elected by a comfortable margin in 2008 and is re-elected in 2012 with a smaller percentage of the vote than he received in his first election. Most incumbent presidents, like Nixon in 72, or Reagan in 84, or Clinton in 1996, tend to sort of accumulate strength and come into their second election and come out of it with a higher percentage of the vote that they did in their first, but not President Obama in 2012. Again, I think a representative of how broken the politics is, because our parties are closely divided. The country's narrowly divided. The parties are closely paired up together. And while the Democrats have won the popular vote in 5 out of the last 6 presidential elections, the Republicans have a slight advantage in the Electoral College that has allowed them to make even races they lost look closer than they might have been. So how do we get here? How do we get to a period where both parties appear to be at each other's throat and not much seems to be able to get done unless something extraordinary happens, like a 60-vote margin in the Senate for 2 years in 2011 and 2009 and 10. I think our system is broken because of the confluence of 2 things. One are long-term influences, things that have been working their way through the American electorate, the American politics, the American economy, the American culture for a period of time. And I mentioned one of them earlier, the trust in our institutions. Now, this is not just in the US that we're seeing a decline in the confidence that people have in their institutions. We're seeing it in Western democracies as well. And maybe this is a result of government having so much to do and so many requirements and so many expectations by the people that they serve that given the nature of the times in which we live, it's impossible to satisfy those. That might be one reason. But I also think that part of it is because both parties are running out of gas. And there are two reasons why. One reason is a good thing. In some respects, both parties have achieved major elements of their agenda. The Republican Party, for example, was the party that was committed to the defeat of Soviet communism, and that happened in the late 1980s, the early 1990s. But that was sort of a glue that kept part of the Republican coalition together. In addition, the Democratic Party achieved a significant element of their agenda by the Civil Rights Revolution, which, even though we have racism in our country today, nonetheless, the country is distinctly different than it was 40 and 50 years ago. And it was because, in large part, some Democrats, and early on aided by some Republicans, were able to pass landmark legislation that began the process of changing our country. In part, though, it's also because of changing circumstances, both here and abroad. Those changing circumstances, in some instances, render old concerns irrelevant, and in other instances, they create new concerns that neither party has really gotten a handle around. One thing, for example, might be the rise of China. Yes, we've been talking about China for a number of years from a trade perspective, but the China that begins to emerge in 2012 is distinctly different from the kind of a China that President Obama faced, President Bush faced, President Clinton faced, President 41 Bush faced, and even Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon faced. Particularly the China that was there in the late 1990s and the early 2000s was far less confident and far less aggressive and more interested in becoming part of the global democracy, the global Western economic situation than the modern China of today, which is an aggressive rival of not only the United States, but of the whole concept of Western democracy. But all of these things, the parties achieving major elements, changing circumstances that rendered old concerns irrelevant, changing circumstances that caused the parties to, as Abraham Lincoln said, to think and act anew, all of these have caused problems for the Democratic and Republican parties. The internet has also been an influence, both good and bad. It's changed the way we collect and share information. It's democratized the organizations of campaigns and made it easier and simpler to organize. It's allowed us to reach more people more quickly and at less expense than traditionally campaigns have done. But it also has its bad elements. It's now easier to spread disinformation more widely, more broadly, and more quickly. Then social media has a tendency to bring out the coarseness and brutality in our political culture that is unseemly and unconstructive. But it's there, and both of those, both the good and the bad, have to be taken into consideration. And finally, in the United States, we have a changing electorate. We're becoming less white, more Black, more brown, more Asian American, and younger. And this more diverse electorate is, contrary to the suppositions of some, less predictable than the old electorate. Times of political change always are less predictable. And for example, last fall, we had with amazement, some people look at the results in the Hispanic community and see that Donald Trump had actually performed pretty well compared to his 2016 performance in the Hispanic community. And that's because we're becoming, with that changing diversity of the electorate, we're seeing changes that are not as clear and easy for us to see. We may be becoming less white, but we're also becoming better educated and and more affluent. And these kind of things have an impact on the outcomes in elections. But those are the long-term influences that have been wending their way through our culture, our politics, our economy, our nation for a number of years. There's some more immediate causes for the circumstances we find ourselves in. We had an unpopular war in Iraq in the late 2000s. But the seminal event, from my perspective, is not the war, it's the 2008 financial crisis. Both Republicans and Democrats had to confront this. The legislation was passed largely to confront it under George W. Bush and largely implemented by President Barack Obama. Yet the way that it was done fed the populist impulses that were already out there. We've always had a sort of dose of populism just below the surface in the American electorate. And in 2008, that populism that sort of lies underneath the surface in America was fed a lot by the way that the whole situation resolved itself. Now, populism is a belief that the little man is somehow getting screwed by the government. The little man and little woman, their relationship with the government has been distorted somehow by somebody nefarious, and the results are bad. And we've got to rejigger that relationship in order that the little man and little woman can get their fair share of whatever's due. And the power structure, the establishment, the deep state, whatever you want to call it, is screwing the little man and the little woman. And as a result of being a sentiment and not a political program per se, it can be co-opted and by both the left and the right and express itself on both the left and the right. On the right, conservatives looked at what happened in the bailout and said, you bailed out a bunch of banks and Wall Street with money you took from me, the little man and the little woman, and thereby distorted the relationship between me and my government. And nobody went to jail. And guess what? You then proceeded to give out more of my money to companies and people that were undeserving, like Solyndra. And that all came out of my pocket. That's sort of where the Tea Party movement came. And on the left, there was a similar impulse. Look, the economy melted down. The little man and the little woman on the left suffered. And as a result, the relationship between them and their government became distorted. Nobody went to jail. And the money came from the little man and the little woman to bail out the big banks. How fair is that? And we need to reestablish and realign the relationship between the little people and their government in order that the little people have power and the government and its powerful allies have less. Now, because of this, both parties got roiled by it. I mean, that's where Bernie Sanders came from. That's where the Tea Party came from. That's where the Freedom Caucus came on the conservative side, and ultimately Donald Trump. It's where the Democratic Socialists and AOC and the Squad all came from, because the original sort of structures of both Republicans and Democrats began to be seen by both people on the right and left as no longer relevant and no longer favorable. Now, how do we get out of this? Well, part of it is just time, because what happens is people come into the system as activists on the right or the left, and eventually some of them sort of become part of the system itself. They begin to occupy positions of responsibility and take on those positions seriously and act in more responsible manners. But I would suggest that there are four things that are critical to the restoration of a politics that works better than we have today. One is presidential leadership. You know, it used to be that the presidency played a lot smaller role in the political life of our country. In fact, in the early decades, the president is clearly a less important figure, particularly in domestic politics, than are the big leaders of Congress, because Congress legislates and the president executes. But we no longer live there. We live in a place where the presidency, for right or wrong, for good or for ill, occupies a bigger space in our political system, and presidential leadership sets a tone for the country. If a president acts in a certain way, then it gets replicated throughout the political system to varying degrees. So we have to have a president who says, it's broken, I want to fix it, and I want to fix not only my party, but both parties, and more importantly, the political system in which both of them operate. There has to be a greater willingness on the part of elements of both parties to compromise and to find common ground. And this is difficult when we have primaries in both parties, in which incumbent office holders face, greater concerns about their primaries than oftentimes about the general elections, because it's the true believers, the fire eaters in both parties' primary electorates that tend to reward people who don't compromise and don't believe in bipartisanship. So we've got to find a way to align rewards of bipartisanship and compromise with electoral strength. We've got to reward people who try and do things in a bipartisan way. This is why, for example, I was delighted that Susan Collins, the Republican senator from Maine, who is a true institutionalist who wants to find common ground and has done so in the past, was reelected in a state where Donald Trump was soundly defeated. She won by 10 points while he was going down by almost as many, which is a pretty strong indication that the people of Maine were going to reward her efforts at bipartisanship and compromise. But we also have to have a commitment to incrementalism, which is one of the hardest things to do when there's populism across the country, because the essence of populism is let's get everything we can our way now. And the system doesn't necessarily work that way and shouldn't work that way. So there has to be a growing interest in making changes in which we find common ground and which tend to be incremental. And then we've got to find causes and issues that cut across party lines. There have got to be things that where both parties can find something that they need and want to get done. Ironically enough, I suspect one of those areas where there's going to be common ground for the next 4 years is in China, where the new administration has taken on rhetorically at least some of the rhetoric of the previous administration, and also being freed by the previous administration from what had been done in previous years by both Republicans and Democrats. They can strike out in a new way. And there are thoughtful leaders on Capitol Hill, both with Republican and Democrat behind their names, who are capable of working with the administration in that way. But I'd simply say this: we've been here before, and we will have to pass through a moment where all of this, works its way through the system, and ultimately then is resolved by the good common sense of the American people exerting themselves as we have done before. Our political system was fractured in the years leading up to the 1800 election, and along came Thomas Jefferson and created a new political system that lasted for another 20 some odd years. The rise of the Democratic Republicans. We then had a system that then the system began to break down after the era of good feelings, and along came a very contentious election, the election of 1824, which resulted in the rise of the first true populist in American politics, Andrew Jackson, whose election in 1828 ushered in another era of American politics. And similarly throughout history, we've had this happen: 1860, 1896, 1932, 1980, where the system appeared to be broken, and somehow or another, someone came along and something happened that reasserted the American political system and put it in a better place. I think part of that is because there's always an underlying confidence by Americans in America. Seems sort of corny, I get that. But I think it's because for Americans, not all of our experience as Americans is tied up in government alone, or even if it's tied up in government, it's not always tied up in the national government. That's one of the benefits of a federalist system. We get to feel strongly about our home states, and we take pride in its accomplishments. But we also take pride in accomplishments in that whole range of activity that happens outside the direct purview of government, or without its specific direction or encouragement or economic support. And so when things in the political system get bad, we've got things that we're confident about: our innovation, our technological prowess, our hardworking ethic, our basic values, the fact that there is something called the American dream, which is real. We all draw confidence from those kind of things, and at some point we reassert it. Winston Churchill was supposed to have said, and he actually never said it, but it's been a saw passed around politicians for the last 50 years. He supposedly said, you can always count on the Americans to do the right thing only after they've tried everything else. Now, as I said, it turns out he never really said that, but about 24 members of Congress or governors say it every couple of years. But it sounds right, and it sounds like something that Churchill would say, and I think it also is right, because we get ourselves in these fixes. And then at some time, something happens in our political system, and people assert themselves, and the system corrects itself. Now, sometimes we lose sight of the fact that it has been worse before. It was bad, obviously, in the 1840s and 1850s, which led to the Civil War as the system came apart, as the battle between slave states and the free states became irreconcilable. There's a wonderful book out by a political scientist named Joanne Freeman called Field of Blood, in which she's examined all the original source material for the 1840s and 1850s to paint a picture of the United States Congress, where it is routine for lots of members to arrive on the floor of the House each and every day carrying a weapon, carrying a pistol or a knife or a Bowie knife or something else that they can use and oftentimes do wield in fights on the floor of the House. Thankfully, very few of them ever brandished a loaded revolver on the floor, but some of them carried them onto the floor. We had the 1830s in which our political system appeared broken. We had 1/4 of the American people out of work. We had widespread deprivation with large elements of the middle class falling into poverty overnight. We had demagogues like Huey Long and Father Coughlin preaching fascism and populist schemes that would have bankrupted the country. And along came a guy racked by polio who couldn't stand and walk on his own, who said we have nothing to fear but fear itself, and the system got healed. The 1960s and 70s, I suspect some of the students here have parents who can recall to you how broken our politics seemed in the late 1960s and early 1970s. A very unpopular war. Our campus is aflame. Our cities, Martin Luther King is assassinated in 1968, and over 140 cities are in flames within a matter of days. We have a president driven from office, Lyndon Johnson, and another one forced from office by the threat of impeachment, Richard Nixon, and our politics seem broken. And yet somehow or another, along came a mild-mannered, B actor from California who reasserted American confidence in itself in 1980. I've studied, as a result of a class I took at UT, the Gilded Age. You talk about how bad things are today. You have not read or studied the Gilded Age. After 1872 and Ulysses S. Grant's reelection, here's the popular war hero, the victor at Appomattox, the man who saved the Union. He gets reelected to a second term, and in the next 5 elections, the country is so divided that nobody gets 50% of the vote. Every president elected between 1872, after 1872, until 1896 is elected with less than 50% of the vote. Not only that, but Congress is bitterly divided. There are 2 years with a Republican president, House and Senate, and 2 years with a Democratic president, House and Senate. And the rest of the period, 18 years, there's divided government with the president of one party and at least one House of the Congress in the hands of the other. And why does that matter? Because they hate each other's guts. They're still fighting the Civil War. When the Democrats take control of the House in 1874 for the first time in 18 years, it's called the victory of the Brigadiers, because so many former Confederate officers are now elected to Congress, many of them by systematically wiping out the black vote in the South, the black Republican vote, with violence that's hard for the modern mind to get its hands around. We have thousands of people assaulted or killed or threatened by violence for decades and decades, election after election, simply because they are black and attempt to want to vote. In 1896, we have 3 states in the South where a majority of the eligible voters, men over the age of 21, are black. And the best that William McKinley, the Republican, can get of that vote, and remember, the black vote in the South in this era is overwhelmingly Republican because of the Civil War. The best that he can get is 24% of the vote in Louisiana. He gets 7% of the vote in Mississippi because the black Republican vote has been wiped out by violence, intimidation. In the politics, nothing gets done. There are a couple of issues. Both Republican farmers and Democratic farmers are fed up with the power of the railroads to charge prices, so they set up the Interstate Commerce Commission. And reformers in both the Democratic and Republican parties are sickened by the urban machines where patronage is handed out and the threat that has for federal jobs. So they passed the Civil Service Act, which is very weak and takes only a fraction of the jobs in the federal government and puts them up for civil service exam. But otherwise, nothing gets done. And the politics is ugly. And the language on the floor of the House and Senate is coarse. And the disputes are big and dangerous. Well over 60 members of the House of Representatives who have been duly elected and certified by their states are kicked out of the Congress for one reason and one reason only. They're in the minority. They won re-election by a small margin, and the majority wants to pad its majority, so they kick them out, Republicans and Democrats. And this is routine. And it's emblematic of the anger of the time. This comes to a climax after the 1888 elections. The Republicans take the presidency with William Henry Harrison and take the House and the Senate, albeit the House narrowly. So what happens? Back then, they were civilized. They swore in the president and the Congress in March. They conducted a little business. They sent everybody home because there was no air conditioning in Washington, D.C., and brought them back in October or November or even December of that year, the odd numbered year, and began their session, and then would run it through until March of the odd numbered year after the next election, in what was the famous lame duck sessions that occurred between the November election and the March 4th beginning of the new Congress. Well, the Democrats, following the 1888 election, announced that in the fall 1889 session, what they're going to do is they are going to deny the House a quorum by they have a vote. Somebody calls for a quorum call. The Democrats refuse to answer the quorum call. They're standing on the floor, milling around. They refuse to answer the quorum call, refuse to say, I'm here. And as a result, none of the votes count. And this goes on month after month after month after month. And finally, on January 29th of 1890, the Speaker of the House, Thomas Brackett Reeds, decides he's had enough of this. He's about 6'2", 300 pounds, looks sort of like a bowling pin with a walrus mustache painted on it, tough, erudite, smart, spends his time reading French literature in the original French, has a library in Maine, one of the largest private libraries with 5,000 books, and he's tough as nails. And on this particular day, they're considering the expulsion of a Democrat member of the House from West Virginia and his replacement by his Republican opponent, who came up about 50 votes short. And so they have a vote on whether or not they're going to expel this member. When they finish, somebody calls for a roll call. The Democrats refuse to answer the roll call, thereby invalidating the vote because the House does not have a quorum to conduct business. And at that point, Speaker Reed starts pointing to Democrats on the floor and directing the clerk to show Mr. Green present, Mr. Smith present, Mr. Jones present. He calls out the name of every Democrat on the floor of the House and calls them by name and tells the clerk to show them present. And all hell breaks loose. All the members start standing up and screaming at him. One member says, "You, under God and the Constitution, you have no right to count me present without my permission." Reed simply says, "The honorable gentleman from Kentucky, does he deny he's present upon the floor of the House?" and moves on. This kicks off a dispute that lasts for 3 days on the floor of the House as to whether or not the Speaker has the right to do this, which ultimately ends up in the U.S. Supreme Court. But for the next several months, going on into 1890, as the Congress meets, they continue to have these kind of disputes over whether or not Reed has the authority to do this. On September 18th, or excuse me, during the debate over this, a Texan, I almost forgot my man, William Henry Howdy Martin, who's a congressman from Athens. William Henry Howdy Martin stands up on the floor of the debate of the House and points his finger at Reed and says, "If any member," turning to his fellow Democrats, "will order me to remove this dictator from his position of power upon the podium, I will do so by force, forthwith." And Reed says, "The honorable gentleman from Texas is out of order," and moves on. Martin is so pissed off the next day, he shows up, takes out his 16-inch long Bowie knife, takes a seat in the seat right in front of the podium on the floor of the House, and spends the entire day methodically sharpening his Bowie knife on the sole of his boot in order to menace the Speaker of the House. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I do not remember Nancy Pelosi doing that with her stilettos when she lost control of the House in 2010. I just don't. But that's the tone of the times. On September 18th, another Texan shows what he's going to do about this. On that particular day, there's another one of these votes. Once again, the Democrats refuse to answer the roll call, the quorum call. Reed directs enough Democrats on the floor to be identified so that they can continue to conduct business. Most of the Democrats absent themselves. And Reed calls up the sergeant at arms and has him try and block the doors. Only one Democrat at that point is able to get out of the House. Constantine August of Rusk County, Texas, Constantine Kilgore of Rusk County, Texas, gave his name to the town of Kilgore, beats the crap out of the sergeant at arms and uses his cowboy boots to kick the slats out of the door and make good his escape. In fact, he knocks the door open with such violence that he breaks the nose of one of the Republicans who's attempting to come in. But that's what the society was like. That's what the politics of America was like. And along comes change, and it comes in 1896. The Democrats nominate a populist firebrand as the Democratic Party literally denies its incumbent Democrat president. It literally reads him out of the party. And they nominate a 36-year-old firebrand who wants to shake up the relationship between the government and the little people, and pits group against group. It's the farmer against the banker. It's the small country merchant against the big companies. It's the little man and the little woman holding a mortgage against the gold merchants of Lombard Street in London and of Wall Street in New York. He is so intent upon pitting group against group that when William Jennings Bryan leaves Lincoln, Nebraska to go to New York to accept the nomination of the Democratic Party, he says to the crowd assembled there, "I go into the enemy's country." New York is a battleground state during the Gilded Age, and he's just said everybody who lives in the East is the enemy. On the other side is a mild-mannered, reform-minded former congressman and former governor of Ohio named William McKinley, one of the sort of forgotten presidents. But he's a remarkable man. He, in his campaign, after some fits and starts, defends conservative economic policies by saying, we're all in this together. We're going to swim or sink together. And if we pit each other against each other, we'll sink. But if we come together in the support of the right kind of policies, then we will all rise together. And we have an obligation to each other to help each other rise. In an era of strong feelings about immigration, he is pro-immigration. The American Protective Association, the largest interest group in the country, says he is the only Republican presidential candidate who is not worthy of their support because he's soft on immigration. But he recognizes the strength that is brought to the country by the waves of immigrants from Italy and Spain and Greece, and some of the traditional sources like England and Scotland and Wales and Germany and the Scandinavian countries that these bring to America. And so he stands up for immigration and beats the APA, and then takes care of insulting them by, at the Republican National Convention, having the opening prayer said by a rabbi and the benediction being given by a black bishop in St. Louis. He is also, in an era of resurgent racism, he is a Civil War veteran who's firmly believed in the Declaration of Independence and its pledge that all men are created equal. He is the first candidate in either the Republican or Democratic parties to openly campaign for black votes by appearing in front of black audiences and asking for their support, which he begins to do in March of 1895. He's a war hero, as I said, and is the first Republican presidential candidate since the Civil War to meet with groups of Confederate war veterans. He invites a group of them from the Shenandoah Valley, where he fought and where he survived 2 suicide missions and received a recommendation for the Congressional Medal of Honor, which he refused by saying, I was only doing my duty. He invited Confederate veterans who were trying to kill him during the Civil War to visit him during the presidential campaign, during his famous front porch campaign in Canton, Ohio. This had never happened since the Civil War. And the sight of blue and gray of Union veterans and Confederate veterans dressed in their respective uniforms, marching behind the American flag while patriotic bands played patriotic music. This caused tens of thousands of people jamming the streets in this little town of Canton, Ohio, many of them to openly weep as this sight passed in front of them. And he took on the bosses of his party. He was not the favored candidate. He was not the front runner. And this is in an era in which both parties had bosses. Tammany Hall, emblematic on the Democratic side, and on the Republican side, the bosses like the easy boss of the New York Republican machine, Thomas Collier Platt, or the blonde boss, William J. Larimer of Chicago, with 10,000 patronage jobs at his disposal. And he McKinley took him on because he was reform-minded. And what happened? He won, and he won in an upset. After a campaign that he was losing in the summer and the early fall, he got his act together and won. When the campaign run by a 32-year-old kid from Ohio who had gone west to make his career in the law in Lincoln, Nebraska, named Charles G. Dawes. He was the actual man who ran the campaign. And when McKinley ran, something happened. American politics changed. Yes, it ushered in a 36-year period of Republican dominance, but more importantly, it unified the country with the largest presidential victory since the reelection of Grant, and a new bipartisanship, spirit of bipartisanship that that leads to a burst of constructive legislation in the early 1900s, many of which we see today. The pure food drug laws, for example, were a result of this sort of progressive era that was led by McKinley and then by his vice president, Theodore Roosevelt, after McKinley's assassination in 1901. My point is that there are moments in which our politics gets healed and things begin to work again. And I'm confident that is going to happen. It's just it's going to take in the right kind of circumstances and the right kind of attitude. And my sense is that moment is coming. I was hoping it would be coming today, but it's going to be a few years off, but it's coming. If you take a look at the leaderships in both parties, there are people in Washington today who went there not in order to appear on Fox News or MSNBC, but in order to get things done. And they're rapidly realizing the way to get things done and make them durable and sustainable is to do them together. Anyway, with that, I end, and I'd be happy to answer some questions. And again, thank you, Mr. President, for having me. For some reason or other, after working in the White House for 7 years, it seems so easy to say, thank you, Mr. President. But thanks for having me, and Will, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Karl. That was absolutely terrific. A tour de force on history and politics and policy and even some signs of hope. So for our audience, we're already seeing, we're going to go to Q&A now. I'm already seeing some great questions popping up in the chat box. So please go to the Q&A portion at the bottom of your screen to type in a question, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. And Karl, I want to, as the moderator here, start off with one or two questions from me, picking up on a number of your remarks. And of course, since so much of the Clements Center's mission is about applying the insights of history to current challenges, I especially appreciate all the history in your talk. As you look back at times of political renewal in our country's history, and of course you just gave a great exploration there of the McKinley renewal in the late 19th century, and you also mentioned in some ways the 1930s under FDR, the 1980s under Reagan. Do you think that the renewal originally starts with the grassroots? Does this something that has to start with the people? Or rather, is it about that special unifying leader coming along, planting the flag and then people rallying to it? Because obviously the presidency is a very big part of it. So and of course it's a little bit of both. I'd love to hear you ruminate on that a little bit more.
I agree. It's both. And I think it depends in times on the circumstances. Whether it's more the leader or more the people, but it requires both. And you're right. I mean, FDR came along, and actually FDR's campaign was very different than what FDR did as president. But the American people demanded change, and Hoover was no longer sufficient. And then the leader emerged, and the leader, became an experimenter. But he also became, on the international front, he helped the country clarify. We'd been through a decade of revulsion over the Great War, World War I, and had become isolationist. And so he was not elected on a platform in which he discussed this, but it was an issue that he had to confront, because as he served as president, he saw the world around him in a different way. Similarly, Ronald Reagan, he did campaign on restoration of America's military strength and upon confronting Soviet communism. So, it just depends, but what the mix is, but the American people have to be a big component of this.
Yeah. Well, that brings me to my next question before we get to the ones in the chat box, which is developing a little bit more something else you said about China, ironically, as potentially a unifying threat, if you will. And again, as you and I both know from history, sometimes it is those external foreign threats that can unify the country. We saw this after 9/11. You certainly see it during World War II. Tell us a little bit more about how you think this might work, where common bipartisan concerns over the growing threat from China could lead to bipartisan cooperation on policy and maybe even on politics too.
Yeah. Well, that's in a nutshell. I mean, the threat from China is one that is being recognized across the political spectrum.
Mhm.
And there's a recognition that the Chinese are an economic rival, a geopolitical rival, a military rival, and that their values are distinctly different from ours, and are a threat. Frankly, we're in a battle to whose values are going to be most accepted. The values of the Chinese Communist Party, which is engaged in uh, genocide against the Uyghurs, and the destruction of democracy in Hong Kong, even though the Chinese signed a international treaty guaranteeing a separate system, a democratic system in Hong Kong. They're now violating that left and right. And they're using their economic power to deny the United States the ability to project its power. This whole Belt and Road Initiative is an attempt to basically build roads, build airports, build port facilities, and indebt the countries that are building them, so much so that the control of those strategic assets falls into the hands of the Chinese, so that they get to decide who can use that airport and who gets to use that port and who can move goods on that rail or that highway. And let's not kid ourselves, the Chinese are not going to be open-minded about this. If they control a vital waterway or a vital air facility, they're going to deny it to the United States if it works to their advantage to do so. So I think there's a growing recognition of that. And as a result, I think there's a likelihood that we will find some sensible policies. But it is going to require people willing to sit down and arrive at a common understanding and a compromise, and then take some hard political decisions. Let me give you one example. I'm a fan of the Obama Pacific Partnership, Trans-Pacific Partnership, because it was essentially, it was essentially a political document saying countries in the Pacific Basin were saying we will lower our tariffs and obstacles to the importation of American goods and services to match roughly the levels that the United States has already set for the importation of our goods and services. We've reduced our barriers. They still, many of them, maintain them high. And in return, what we want is a strong economic relationship with the United States that guarantees us as a counterweight to the Chinese. So I don't understand to this day why Obama didn't get it voted through in Congress when he did, but we've got to find some new iteration of that that's got enough change in it that Republicans can say that's different, and yet enough Democrat support, because it's a Democrat initiative, that it could get passed into law.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's, I think, a particularly good example, especially because after the U.S. pulled out of the TPP, as you know, China created its own regional trade agreement that a lot of those Asian countries joined, even though they would have preferred to be in the one with us. So
yeah, I mean, the Chinese, let's be honest, they're thugs in this regard. One of the reasons those countries joined it was they were threatened. I mean, I've been involved in a project. No need to dwell on the details of it, but the leader of one small country in Europe literally had a Chinese trade mission show up on his doorstep, and one of the members remained behind in order to threaten him, literally like a gangster would, for taking an action which was in support of U.S. initiatives. So if they're doing that to little countries in Europe, you can imagine what they're doing to countries in less developed countries around the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly, especially in the Asia Pacific. So, okay, turning now to, we got a number of great questions from the audience. This one comes from one of our doctoral fellows here, Theo Milanopoulos. And Theo's question is this: you mentioned the 2008 financial crisis as the roots for the current period of political realignment and dysfunction, in part because the institutions didn't deliver enough aid to individuals and small businesses for recovery. Will the pandemic have a similar effect? And do the latest stimulus bill and proposed infrastructure legislation offer a path forward to recovery?
Yeah, look, let me clarify. With regard to the 2008, I think it was less that small business people said, well, you didn't bail me out, and more that you took money from me and bailed them out. In this one, I do think that the government took, and again, it's ironic, that one of the great architects of one of the better parts of this, the PPP program, was Susan Collins, who said, how do we get money directly into the hands of small business people that will allow them to keep their employees on the payroll? And, you know, in a situation like this, you're going to end up taking a big chunk of money and spending it, and some of it's going to get wasted. But her view was, let's put it in the hands of the employers and they've got to affirm that they have kept their workers on their payroll and that they've spent the money properly. And we're going to have fraud, and we're going to have to go find it. But this is going to be the best way for us to assure that money gets into the hands of people who needed it. And I think that was the best way. I'm not as much of a fan as others are of the stimulus checks, because I think they went to too many people. I have two friends. They're elderly aunts, or sisters, excuse me, aunts of mother and aunt of a friend of mine living in South Carolina, and they got the check last year and they were offended. Why do we need it? We've got Social Security and savings, and we've got each of us own our condos, and why are they sending us money? And similarly, this year, we're going to send money up to people who are making whatever it was, $120,000 a year. There have been economic studies suggesting that a significant amount of the money that has gone out in stimulus checks has been, saved. And sometimes it's been saved by investing in the stock market. And maybe that's all good, well and good. But I do think this is different than 2008 in this respect. I think in this one, people realized that ordinary Americans were hurting, and they wanted things done to help those ordinary Americans. So we're willing to tolerate money going to small businesses that might have been playing funny money with that, because most of it was not. Most of it ended up in the hands of small businesses that paid it to their workers. We're willing to send out stimulus checks because, well, yeah, maybe there are people who didn't deserve to get it, and maybe we had all those people in prisons, signing up and blah blah blah. But it got money into the hands of people who desperately needed it at that moment. So I think there's going to be less of a reaction to what was done essentially in 2020 and through early 2021. But I do think the patience of the American people is going to wear out at some point with, how much of that money really do you need to be borrowing for, quote, the emergency, when things appear to be getting back to normal, and we seem to be able to get going again without spending all that much more money. And some of it seems to be not for things that are of immediate need, but for your own list of political items that you wanted to achieve. So at some point, that tension is going to emerge. It emerged very early in 2009, but I think it's going to emerge here in 2021 sooner rather than later.
Okay, great, thanks. All right, our next question pivots off a comment you'd made earlier about that sometimes primaries bringing out the people running to the extremes. And this question is from Robert Murkison. And he asked, has gerrymandering, which creates very blue or very red districts, added to the dysfunction? And if it has, what can we do about it?
Yeah, well, first of all, the dysfunction's been there forever. Let's not kid ourselves. Elbridge Gerry, the governor of Massachusetts, after whom the practice was named, he wasn't the first guy to practice it. And frankly, I don't have a good answer on this, because I do think, if you got the power, you use the power. I mean, think about it. I think it's 40% of the vote in California in congressional elections, contested congressional elections where there were Republican and Democrat on the ballot in the November election, went to Republicans, and Republicans have something like 11 out of 55 seats in the California delegation. In Maryland, last time around, 10 years ago, we used to have 2 Republican delegations, one of them on the Eastern Shore, and including the sort of the northeastern part of the state, including some of the Baltimore suburbs, and then one district that was the far western part of the state. So what did they do? They cut up the far western part of the state and divided it among 3 other Democratic congressional districts in order to create kill a Republican congressional district and create another Democrat. So neither party's hands are clean on this. I mean, I'm watching with delight New York, which used to have a Republican state Senate. So they made an agreement with the Democrats that they would have a commission that would do the redistricting. And then the Republicans lost the majority in the state Senate 2 years ago. And what's happened? The Democrat majority is now trying to get rid of the commission. The commission they tried to say, we're not going to give you any money. And they made a stink about that to operate. And now the commission's operating. And now they're saying, well, you know what? It used to be that we would have to have a 2/3 vote to overturn the recommendation of the committee. We want to be able to do it just with a simple majority. So they're trying to kill the commission. So I don't have a good answer on it. I do think, though, that this has been around forever, and it's just that the nature of the primary voters is frankly more important than whether or not we could find a fix to the gerrymandering issue. There's only one state that has been able to fix the gerrymandering issue, I think, in a fair way, and that's Iowa. Iowa has typically had either 6 congressional districts, 5 congressional districts, or 4. They now have 4, and they draw them, so that there's one in the southeast, one in the northeast, one in the southwest, one in the northwest, and they do it fair. They minimize how many county lines they cut, et cetera, et cetera. But that's because Iowans are a pleasant people. I mean, nobody else seems to be able to pull it off. Every other commission, I love it. California had their first commission, and after they carved up the state, Democrats went around and said, literally gave interviews saying, well, this is how we jimmied the system and gained the advantage in the redistricting. Here's what we did for each one of the meetings in order to create, the incentive for them to do what we wanted them to do, which is, not the impartial judges or lawgivers that we were hoping to see.
Okay, our next question comes from one of our faculty members, Professor Kirill Avramov, who is a specialist on Russian disinformation, among other things. And his question is this: do you think we will witness a unified position and bipartisan consensus on Russia, similar to what you described with recognizing China's threat?
I think so, but I think it's going to take a little bit longer to sort of come together, in part because of the statements and attitudes of the former president with regard to Russia. I think they're on the Republican side. I've talked to a number of the Republicans on foreign relations and foreign affairs in the respective houses, and there's a recognition that Russia, the threat that we have from Russia. But I think it's going to take a little bit longer to get a consensus there, because it gets complicated by the former president's rhetoric, and it gets also complicated by things like Hunter Biden in Ukraine. But I think Putin is probably going to be help us get a consensus quicker than it might otherwise arise, because I think he's got a terrible misreading of a U.S. resolve and NATO's resolve with his recent movements to shore up the separatists in eastern Ukraine.
Yeah.
And I think also I like the tough attitude that we've seen out of the Biden administration with regard to the Nord Stream, because we really do need to. If Europe needs natural gas, it needs to come from the United States. We'll be a better partner for them, and it will be geopolitically better for them than to be reliant upon Russia. And it was amazing to me. They think about this a lot. When Bush left office, they approached a significant member of his cabinet who was close to the president personally, and tried to hire him as a consultant to the Russian energy industry, and he refused. Well, Chancellor Schroeder was not as quick to refuse. In fact, he accepted. Mm-hmm. So this is what the Russians were doing, was hiring Western influencers to help them reduce the antipathy in the West to getting in bed with Russia. And if we do get into bed with Russia, or if Europe gets into bed with Russia, it ain't going to be a pretty sight, and it's going to end poorly.
Yeah. Well, I think every Texan can agree with you there on wanting more Europe to buy more American natural gas, and rather than Germany buying so much Russian gas there. And of course, Putin's also cozying up quite a bit to Xi Jinping, and so maybe Russia's embrace of China will also be more of a wake-up call. So,
when was the last time Russia did anything that wasn't against American interest?
Yeah, the question answers itself. That's right. So, okay, we've got time for just a couple more questions here. This one comes from Larry O'Brien, and he says the Democrats seem to be intent on carrying forward much of their agenda through reconciliation in Congress rather than compromise. Reconciliation, for our listeners, is a technical term for how they can bypass the need for a 60-vote supermajority. The Republican Party is still trying to recover from the end of the Trump presidency. And so Larry's question is this: is it possible that your catalyst for change to fix our politics will make progress actually in the near term, or do we need to wait until at least 2022 or 2024?
Well, yeah, it's going to be 2022 or 2024, because I think the opening moves in the Biden administration were, I watched his inaugural speech, and it was powerful when he said, my whole soul is in this, unifying the country. But they've not acted that way since. I don't mean to be overly critical, but their definition of bipartisanship is, we look at a poll question, and if a majority of Republicans say that they're in favor of mom apple pie and the American flag, then by God, we've got a bipartisan measure. Well, that's not true. And even if you use reconciliation, you make a huge mistake if you use reconciliation as a partisan weapon and not as a tool to get something done in a bipartisan way. Bush used reconciliation to pass his tax cut in June of 2001, but a quarter of the Democrats in the Senate voted for it. And why? Because we sat down with Max Baucus and negotiated. Baucus said, I don't want the top rate to be 33%. Can't go that low. You got to be at 35, and you got to agree that any money that is raised by keeping the top rate at 35 as opposed to 33 goes to take people off it at the bottom end of the scale. And you can't make it permanent. It has to be for 10 years. And here are a couple of other things. Now, none of those we wanted to do, but we also wanted to get a bill done, and we wanted to get it done in a bipartisan way. So we did it, and we did it under reconciliation with every Republican of the 50 Republicans, or at that point, 49 Republicans voting for it, but a quarter of the Democrats voting for it as well. So I think the president would be well advised to use his reconciliation authority, which is limited to how many times you can use it in each fiscal year. I think he'd be wise to try and find some elements that he can pass outside of reconciliation, because there are elements that will draw 60 Republican votes, draw at least 10 Republican votes and give him 60 to proceed.
Mm-hmm. All right. And then this question from George Casey: how does a good, and he puts this in quotes, a good presidential candidate survive the far left or the far right base demands during the presidential primaries? This gets back to your point about the importance of presidential leadership.
Yeah, well, we saw that incidentally in 2020, with Joe Biden. Biden oftentimes was raising his hand with everybody else on that stage, but occasionally he was taking a big, he's taking a different stance. And in fact, the whole argument was he's the normal Democrat, and only a normal Democrat can beat Donald Trump. And he's not going to be far out there on the left like a Bernie Sanders or, some of these other weird things. So he was the traditional, sort of liberal Democrat. And he won as a result, I think. And to some degree, I'd argue that Trump he did not appeal to the hard right. Yes, he said, I'm pro-life, and yes, I'm in favor of a strong military, and I'll appoint conservative judges. But he was a populist more than he was, part of the hard right. He took dissatisfaction that existed throughout the party with sort of the state of things as they were, and sort of took that anger and used it by saying, I hear you, and I'm not going to stand for politics as normal. I'm going to be the guy who throws the bricks through the plate glass window, or takes the meat axe to the steak, or whatever analogy you want to use. He was the disruptor, and I think that's a little bit different than what we see in primaries for the House and Senate, where it becomes who's the most right wing or who's the most left wing. I do think the Republicans will have a variant in this in 2022 that'll have a big impact on the outcome, which is Trump's endorsement. Because if Trump endorses flawed candidates like he did in Georgia, actually in Alabama with Roy Moore, it's going to be hard to get him across the finish line.
Yeah. All right, well, Karl, we are coming up to the end of our time here, and you've been incredibly generous with your time and insights. Before you go, we do have one more important question from the audience I want to read, and this comes from Doreen Combs, one of our former doctoral fellows here. I'll just read it verbatim, and I think our audience will appreciate this one. Will, this is a very serious question for Mr. Rove. What is your dog's name? So I think Doreen enjoys seeing you.
Yeah, my dog, Little Bit. She just got back. A little bit, yeah. She has a little bit of white on her tail. She is the most genial, happy dog you will ever meet. And I don't know what the rules are. Maybe I'll bring her to class with me this fall. But Little Bit just was at the groomers, and the groomer let her back into the house, and she came into her favorite place, which is to sit in my chair and watch me. And occasionally, see that little gesture? She's sort of indicating it's time to come over and give her a scratch.
Well, wonderful. Well, she was a great guest for this fascinating discussion today. As far as the question of dogs on campus and bringing them to class, I will defer to our president on that one. So, but Karl, thanks again. Jay, over to you for any final words.
Thank you very much. Thanks again, Will, for putting this on, and Karl, I really enjoyed the talk, and give us a lot to think about as we try to move forward and try to find more common ground as a society, and hopefully look forward to some better times together. I wish I could take your class. I think that'd be awesome. I wish a little bit would be there also. I'll check into the dog policy. But thanks everybody who attended, and we look forward to more thought-provoking discussions together, and take care and hook 'em horns.
Hook 'em. That's right. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Karl.
Thank you.